In a town that smiles in sunlight and judges in shadows, a woman's quiet grocery run becomes a confrontation with centuries of prejudice. Two officers thought they'd picked the wrong woman. They were right, because she's not alone. When Big Shaq pulls up with a police chief who owes him a debt, Coral Bay's secrets won't just be exposed, they'll be judged. What starts as harassment ends in reckoning. This isn't just a story about power, it's about how you choose to use it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun rolled over Coral Bay, stretching its golden fingers across rows of palatial homes, manicured lawns, and a main street lined with pastel-colored shops. A light breeze danced through the palm trees, and the world seemed soaked in honeyed light, dripping warmth onto the sleepy coastal town. Coral Bay looked like a picture-perfect slice of Florida living, where fortunes were old, traditions were older, and the unspoken rules were the oldest of all. Behind the manicured smiles and Sunday brunches, old prejudices clung to the bones of this town like barnacles on a forgotten shipwreck. Veronica Lane O'Neill, poised and striking, stepped out of her silver SUV in front of Marlowe's grocery, her braided hair catching the light like strands of molten copper. Her presence turned heads, not because she was Shaquille O'Neal's wife, not because of the designer sunglasses perched on her nose, but because she dared to exist here, unbothered, regal, and unafraid. She carried herself with a grace that was almost defiant, and in a town like Coral Bay, where appearance was currency, Veronica's confidence unsettled those who clung tightly to the old lines drawn in the sand. She adjusted her tote bag over her shoulder, and glanced at the storefronts, their quaintness disguising the unease she could feel buzzing just under the surface. It wasn't overt. It never was. It was in the way conversations halted as she passed, in the way two elderly women squinted behind their sunglasses, whispering words that melted into the warm air. It was the way the cashier inside the store tensed as she noticed Veronica approaching. Coral Bay was a master of smiling while baring its teeth. Inside Marlowe's, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the citrusy bite of cleaning agents. Veronica moved down the aisles with quiet purpose, gathering a few necessities. A young mother with a stroller edged away from her near the dairy case, pretending to fiddle with her shopping list. Veronica, too familiar with the signs, exhaled a slow, controlled breath, and forced her mind to stay on the mundane. Eggs, milk, bread, the things that grounded a day, the rituals of normalcy. Outside, unnoticed by Veronica, two patrol officers cruised by in a black and white, the windows down, their mirrored sunglasses catching the sun. Deputy Colton Hayes, broad-shouldered and itching for a reason to step out of the monotony of his shift, spotted Veronica's car immediately. It wasn't that it was parked illegally. It wasn't that it was an eyesore. It gleamed like a trophy under the sun. It was simply that it didn't seem to belong in the unspoken tapestry of Coral Bay, and neither to him did the woman it belonged to. Hayes nudged his partner, Deputy Reed Lancaster, a wiry man, with sharp features and an even sharper disdain buried under his polished badge. No words were exchanged, just a nod, the kind of communication that carried generations of understanding without needing a single syllable. They pulled the car into a slow roll and parked near Veronica's SUV, stepping out with the lazy confidence of men who believed the day was already theirs to command. Veronica, emerging from Marlowe's a few minutes later with her bag tucked against her side, didn't notice them at first. Her mind was on Shaq. He was flying back from a charity event that evening, and she wanted to surprise him with his favorite home-cooked meal. It was a small thing, a sweet thing, the kind of gesture that didn't make headlines but made love tangible. She didn't see the way the deputies watched her, the way they adjusted their belts and squared their shoulders as if preparing for something more than a simple good morning. It was only when she approached her car that the shift in the air became undeniable. The lazy chatter of the town square seemed to hush. A dog barked in the distance and was quickly silenced. Veronica glanced up and found herself face to face with Deputy Hayes, who gave her a tight smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Ma'am, this your vehicle?" he asked, his tone syrupy and suspicious all at once. Veronica, sensing the coiled tension, answered calmly, "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" Lancaster circled the SUV slowly, his hand brushing over the mirror, the door handle, the trunk, like he was searching for something that wasn't there. His every movement was a silent accusation, and the longer he took, the more eyes from the cafe across the street turned their way. Spectacle was brewing, and Coral Bay, for all its charms, loved a good spectacle. especially when it confirmed their whispered fears. Hayes pretended to scrutinize Veronica's license plate, while tossing casual loaded questions about registration, ownership, intent. Veronica remained composed. Her responses clipped but polite. She had been through this dance before in different cities, different states, different climates. The setting changed but the music stayed the same. A black woman in a place they believed she didn't deserve to be. The heat of the sun pressed harder against the back of her neck, but she refused to let it see her sweat. She could feel the tremor in her hands, could feel the anger simmering just beneath her skin, but she anchored herself to dignity the way a sailor anchors to the bedrock in a storm. She pulled out her driver's license, her registration, her insurance, flawless, clean, undeniable. Yet she knew from the way Hayes's lips twitched that this was never about documents. It was about presence, about reminding. From the corner of her eye, Veronica noticed a few townspeople pretending not to stare while recording the encounter on their phones. The ground beneath this town's golden surface was beginning to crack, and though Veronica didn't know it yet, this crack would soon split wide open. She offered a soft, prayer-like thought to the heavens as she slid into the driver's seat. Patience, protect me. She thumbed her phone where it sat in her lap, hidden from view, tapping out a single message to the one person who could shatter this nightmare into dust. Shaq, it's happening again. Outside, Hayes and Lancaster shared a smirk as they moved back to their cruiser, but they didn't leave. They parked there like sentinels, keeping watch, as if daring her to make the wrong move. Veronica, back stiff against the leather seat, gripped the wheel and whispered to herself, "Not today." Overhead, the seagulls circled lazily, indifferent to the brewing storm below. Coral Bay basked under its sun-drenched facade, but beneath that beauty, something ugly was waking up, and it would not be ignored for much longer. Veronica sat frozen in her car for a moment longer, her fingers curled tightly around the steering wheel. She breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs and press down the fear that threatened to rise like a tide. She wasn't new to moments like these, but each time carved a little deeper. She glanced into the rearview mirror. Hayes and Lancaster remained in their cruiser, sunglasses still masking their eyes, their posture relaxed but watchful, the posture of men who felt entitled to judge, to dominate, to control. Summoning every ounce of her resolve, Veronica slipped her phone into her tote bag, adjusted her sunglasses, and exited her car again. If she let them intimidate her into leaving, they would win. Coral Bay's poison was passive, but it was potent, and today she refused to drink it. She smoothed down the front of her summer dress, drew herself up tall, and crossed back toward Marlowe's entrance. She could feel the weight of the deputy's gaze trail her every step. Inside, the store's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, washing the aisles in a harsh glow. The cold from the air conditioning nipped at her skin, an almost shocking contrast to the thick warmth outside. Veronica pushed a cart forward, the wheels squeaking in protest, and tried to focus on the simple, grounding act of shopping. Her list was short: fresh basil, chicken, sweet potatoes, and a few of Shaq's favorite cookies. It should have been an ordinary trip, but the undercurrent of tension from outside had seeped into the store, soaking into the walls and floorboards. The first sign came near the produce section. An older man in a khaki fishing hat accidentally brushed against her cart and muttered something under his breath, something just loud enough for Veronica to hear the disdain in his voice, even if the exact words were lost. She glanced up sharply, but the man had already turned away, inspecting oranges as if the moment had never happened. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep moving. Dorothy Caldwell, the store's owner and a fixture of Coral Bay society, watched Veronica from behind the bakery counter. Her expression was carefully arranged into a smile, but her eyes betrayed a wary distance, like a shopkeeper trying to decide if a stray dog was dangerous or merely lost. Veronica caught the glance, filed it away without comment, and pressed deeper into the aisles, choosing to focus on the labels before her. By the time she reached the meat section, the store felt colder, the eyes sharper. A young stockboy stacking loaves of bread nearby suddenly found reasons to linger, his gaze flickering nervously between Veronica and the front door. The casual hostility draped over her like a weighted blanket, suffocating in its silence. She knew what they were thinking, knew that to them her designer bag, her confident walk, her very presence were acts of defiance. As she selected a package of chicken breasts and dropped them into her cart, a woman a few feet away tightened her grip on her purse. Veronica caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, the way the woman pulled her handbag closer to her body like a shield. The unspoken accusation burned hotter than any words could have. It wasn't the first time Veronica had been painted as a threat for simply existing. But each stroke of that ugly brush left a fresh welt on her spirit. Outside, Hayes and Lancaster were growing restless. Lancaster drummed his fingers against the cruiser's doorframe, his jaw tight. Hayes fiddled with the radio before snapping it off with an irritated grunt. In their minds, Veronica's presence was a provocation. A black woman in a place she didn't belong, driving a car she shouldn't afford, wearing clothes that screamed confidence rather than apology. It gnawed at them. She's taking her sweet time, Lancaster muttered, watching her figure pass behind the store's glass windows. Hayes smirked. Patience. Rats always scurry when the trap closes. Their words were coated with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of unchecked authority. From knowing that even when they were wrong, the system would bend to shield them. They weren't looking for trouble. They were manufacturing it, brick by silent brick. Inside, Veronica reached the checkout line and placed her few items onto the conveyor belt. The cashier, a teenage girl with a nervous smile and a visible tremor in her hands, scanned each item with exaggerated care. Veronica noticed the girl glance quickly at the security camera mounted above the register, as if seeking guidance or cover. She placed her card into the reader, completed the transaction with the soft beep of approval, and gathered her bags. As Veronica turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of Dot Caldwell speaking in hushed tones to another employee, her eyes slicing toward Veronica with undisguised suspicion. Veronica's chest tightened, but she didn't falter. She stepped out into the Florida sun once more, squinting against the sudden brightness, her steps measured and deliberate. She didn't even reach her SUV before Hayes and Lancaster were moving. They exited their cruiser with an almost choreographed grace, Hayes adjusting his belt and Lancaster cracking his knuckles. Veronica slowed, but didn't stop. She had given them no reason, no excuse, but she knew they didn't need one. Not here. Not now. Ma'am, Hayes barked, his voice loud enough to snap the attention of every coffee sipper at the cafe across the street. Veronica turned slowly, setting her shopping bags on the asphalt beside her. She lifted her chin, the sunlight catching the glint of her wedding ring, the O'Neill name engraved elegantly inside. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her face betrayed none of it. She was the wife of Shaq O'Neill. But right now, in Coral Bay's eyes, she was just another problem to be dealt with. We're gonna need to see some identification, Lancaster said, stepping closer, hand resting near his belt, near his taser, but not quite touching. The movement wasn't necessary. It was a message, a warning wrapped in a performance of authority. Veronica said nothing. She reached into her tote bag with slow, deliberate movements and withdrew her ID and car registration. She held them out, calm and steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of fear. Hayes took them, examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, and exchanged a glance with Lancaster. It was clear, the paperwork was in order. No violations, no warrants, no reason. But the game wasn't about paperwork. It was about humiliation. Car like this, Hayes drawled, nodding toward the SUV, costs more than most folks' houses around here. Pretty fancy ride. You sure it's yours? Veronica's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She didn't answer the insult. She didn't need to. She knew better than to escalate. Knew that indignation would be twisted against her in an instant. Instead, she let the silence do its work. Around them, the crowd thickened. Small, curious, hungry for a spectacle. The heat shimmered off the asphalt, the sun hammering down without mercy. Veronica could feel the first droplets of sweat slide down her spine, but she remained still, composed. She let her eyes drift deliberately to the faces staring at her. The old man from the produce section, the woman who had clutched her purse, even Dot Caldwell peering from the store's doorway. Each face was a mirror, reflecting Coral Bay's true soul back at her. In her mind, Veronica counted backward from 10, anchoring herself in the math of control. By the time she reached 3, her phone vibrated once in her bag, a brief, urgent buzz. Shaq had seen her message. Help was already coming. Hayes and Lancaster didn't notice. They were too busy basking in the thin, greasy satisfaction of manufactured dominance. But their time was running out, and the storm they had unwittingly summoned was already gathering beyond the horizon. As Veronica stood there beneath the blinding Florida sun, alone but unbroken, she thought of Shaq's voice, warm, steady, larger than life, promising her that no matter where she went, no matter what darkness tried to touch her, he would find her. And she smiled, the smallest, sharpest smile. because she knew that promise was about to be fulfilled in a way Coral Bay would never forget. The heat pulsed against the pavement, thick and oppressive, as if the sky itself had drawn closer to witness what was about to unfold. The weight of the sun, the stillness in the air, and the undercurrent of curiosity, rippling through the bystanders, gave the moment a strange theatrical quality, like the whole town was leaning in, waiting for a cue. Veronica stood at the center of it all, isolated, but not invisible, quite the opposite. She was now the nucleus of a scene quickly spinning out of control. Hayes handed her documents back with deliberate slowness, his fingers lingering just long enough to make the exchange feel invasive. "Your registration checks out," he said with a smirk that danced at the edge of insult. "But a car like this, ma'am, raises questions. You wouldn't believe the fraud we see around here." He tilted his head, pretending to give her a fair look, but everything about his posture reeked of mock civility. His smile stretched too wide, too forced plastic over menace. Lancaster stepped closer again, flanking Veronica as if she were prey. "Mind popping the trunk for us?" he asked, voice oily, almost cheerful. "Just standard procedure. Random check. You understand?" Veronica didn't move. Her expression remained calm, but a storm brewed behind her eyes. She knew the game they were playing. They weren't asking. They were daring her to say no, daring her to object, so they could escalate. It was the kind of manipulation that didn't make the headlines, the kind that slid just beneath the legal surface, but tore at dignity all the same. "I don't consent to a search," she said, her voice steady. "You have no probable cause." A beat of silence passed. Hayes's smile thinned. Lancaster laughed. Just once, a short, sharp exhale that turned heads on the sidewalk. "Well now," he said, "that's a very rehearsed answer." From the doorway of the cafe, a man with a laptop lowered his screen. A teenage girl sipping lemonade beside her mother leaned forward, eyes wide. Whispers curled through the crowd, the sound like dry leaves scraping down a sidewalk. People didn't look away anymore. They watched with sharpened focus, drawn by the scent of power flexed unjustly. Coral Bay didn't often get this close to its own hypocrisy, but when it did, it made sure to bring popcorn. "Ma'am," Hayes said, "if you're not hiding anything, you shouldn't have a problem. Cooperation makes things easier." Veronica could feel every pair of eyes pressing into her skin. Her throat was dry, her palms damp, but she refused to break. She opened her bag again, not to hand them anything, but to retrieve her phone once more. She lifted it slowly, turned it toward the officers, and hit record. The crowd gasped, quietly but audibly. It was a small act, yet seismic in its defiance. The phone became her shield. Her voice, soft but resonant, sliced through the tension like a blade. "You're being recorded," she said, and in those 4 words she reclaimed the moment. Hayes's jaw tightened. Lancaster took a single step back, not enough to suggest guilt, but just enough to register discomfort. The illusion cracked. The invisible line between intimidation and accountability had been drawn, and now they were standing on the wrong side of it. But instead of retreating, they pivoted. Hayes turned toward the crowd and began speaking loud enough for all to hear. "We're just trying to make sure everything's in order," he announced, holding up his hands in mock transparency. "No one's above the law." It was a performance, and a clever one at that. Flip the narrative. Flip the blame. Make her look like the one overreacting, the one hiding something. It was the oldest tactic in the book. Smile while cutting, bow while burying the blade, and yet Veronica held firm, unmoved by the dance. The cafe owner, a balding man in a checkered apron, stepped just outside his doorway, his arms crossed. He said nothing, but his presence added another set of eyes to the audience. Across the street, a florist paused her sweeping to watch. Even Dot Caldwell, still standing near the entrance to Marlowe's, took a few steps forward, her expression unreadable. Veronica felt the town breathing with her, against her, around her. Then Lancaster leaned in, close enough for only her to hear. His voice dropped to a murmur, coated in venom masked as civility. "Lady like you, with a name like O'Neill, should know better than to stir trouble in someone else's town." The words hit harder than any shove. They carried history in them, a history that whispered of cotton fields, sundown towns, fire hoses, and laws written to look neutral, but bleed bias. It was a reminder that to men like him, her last name didn't earn her respect, it made her a target. But what he didn't see was the steel running through her spine. What he underestimated was the woman who had walked beside greatness, and carved her own strength along the way. Veronica stepped back, her voice rising not in volume, but in clarity. "This town," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his, "belongs to everyone who lives here. That includes me." And just like that, the tide shifted. A man near the edge of the sidewalk clapped once, slow, deliberate, then another. The sound was hesitant at first, unsure, but it spread like fire across dry grass. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was steady. It wasn't for spectacle, it was for courage. Hayes and Lancaster turned toward the noise, blinking in surprise as the very crowd they thought would be silent began to stir with conscience. Some looked ashamed, others curious, but all of them were now participants in a moment that refused to be buried. Hayes cleared his throat, forced another smile. "That's fine, ma'am. You're free to go." His words were slick, controlled, but his tone betrayed frustration. He had lost control of the narrative. Lancaster said nothing, his jaw ticking as he walked back toward their cruiser. They hadn't gotten what they came for, and that truth settled around them like ash. As they pulled away, Veronica remained still, eyes fixed on their taillights until they disappeared beyond the bend of Main Street. Only then did she move. She bent to retrieve her groceries, one bag at a time, her hands steady despite the tremble running beneath her skin. When she rose, she caught sight of Dot Caldwell once more, still watching. Their eyes locked for a beat, and though Dot said nothing, Veronica saw something shift behind the woman's practiced expression. Whether guilt, realization, or merely discomfort, she couldn't say. She turned without waiting for acknowledgement, and climbed back into her SUV. The silence inside wrapped around her like a sanctuary, the faint hum of the engine whispering promises of escape. But this wasn't over. Not yet. She knew what she had done had ripples, and somewhere beyond the veil of this quiet coastal town, someone was already watching the footage. Someone who would care. Veronica didn't smile. Not yet. But she did feel something settle deep inside her chest, a sense of reckoning blooming on the horizon, and it was coming. The SUV rolled forward in the silence, engine humming like a lullaby, struggling to mask the static in Veronica's mind. Her hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the smooth leather, but her jaw remained firm, eyes fixed on the curve ahead. The store, the crowd, the officers, all faded into the rear view, but the weight of what had just transpired sat squarely on her shoulders. There was no time to collapse, not now, not when she could feel Coral Bay tightening its grip around her, inch by inch. She didn't drive home, not yet. Instead, she turned onto one of the smaller roads near the public park, Lakeview Circle, a winding stretch where tree-lined sidewalks blurred into manicured hedges and pastel mailboxes. Her plan had been to stop briefly by the community flower market nearby, an open-air strip dotted with white tents and wooden stalls, mostly run by local retirees, who sold lavender bundles and organic jams. She knew she'd be noticed there, but she also knew she'd be seen. That distinction, today, mattered. Pulling into a gravel spot under a willow tree, Veronica stepped out again, this time leaving her phone in hand, camera still set to video just in case. She didn't trust Coral Bay anymore. Or maybe, she never had. She only trusted proof. The moment her heels touched the gravel, a hush rippled across the flower market. It was subtle, no loud silence, no halted footsteps, but she felt it, like a shift in the wind that raised the hairs on your neck. The woman at the bouquet stall, a wiry blonde with a sun hat and a pinched expression, paused mid-conversation with another customer. A pair of teenagers nearby muttered something that ended in muffled laughter. A middle-aged man behind a honey stand stopped stacking jars, arms folding across his chest with deliberate calm. Veronica walked through it all, her posture a mask of serenity. It wasn't just glances anymore. It was posture, distance, an orchestrated dance of subtle rejection. "Ma'am," came a voice, soft, clipped. It belonged to the woman with the sun hat. "I think you might be looking for the Downtown Farmers Co-op. They have a broader selection." Veronica paused, not because the suggestion confused her, but because the message beneath it was deafeningly clear. She turned slowly to face the woman, giving her a chance to retract the insult. But the woman only adjusted her hat and offered a tight-lipped smile. "No," Veronica replied, voice calm, cutting. "I'm exactly where I want to be." The woman blinked, but said nothing. A quiet buzz began around her, like mosquitoes circling just out of reach. She heard it again, those careful whispered judgments. Words like entitled, disrespectful, and the one they didn't dare say aloud, but hung in every breath. Other. One by one, subtle turned sinister. A man pretended to trip near her car, resting his hand against the window as if inspecting for damage. Another customer loudly asked the cashier if the market still allowed outsiders to park that close to the stalls. A little boy pointed at Veronica's car and asked his mother why a basketball player's car was in the neighborhood. And the mother, rather than shush him, replied with, "Some folks don't understand boundaries, sweetie." Veronica's chest tightened. Her instinct told her to leave. Every part of her, honed by years of surviving the world's polite racism, screamed that she'd overstayed her welcome in this sun-drenched minefield. But another part, quieter, deeper, urged her to stay just long enough to make the moment theirs, not hers. She walked to the far end of the market and picked up a small clay pot of rosemary, handing a $5 bill to the elderly vendor who refused to meet her eyes. As she turned back toward her SUV, she saw it, the same black and white patrol cruiser, Hayes and Lancaster again, cruising slowly down the road, like sharks scenting blood in the water. Their car moved at a crawl, both windows rolled down, radio silent, the engine barely audible over the wind. This wasn't a routine pass, it was surveillance, a threat masquerading as coincidence. Veronica locked eyes with Hayes. He raised 2 fingers to his temple in a mock salute, then tapped the dashboard casually. A knowing gesture, a provocation, and the crowd noticed. That was the most chilling part. The market-goers had already seen the earlier encounter outside Marlowe's. The footage had likely circulated. Whispers were already blooming on social media. Hashtags spinning in quiet corners. Yet here they were. Same woman, same vehicle, same officers. Again. This wasn't just an escalation. This was a message that even when caught, the system bends back into place like bone refusing to heal properly. Fear moved through Veronica's body like water finding cracks. It didn't shake her hands or trip her steps. It made her sharper. She straightened, held the potted herb like a symbol, and walked with the grace of someone refusing to be erased. Hayes and Lancaster pulled the cruiser over at the corner, just watching. They didn't exit. They didn't call out. Their presence was the performance now, a shadow cast longer than their actions. The crowd no longer needed a reason to fear. They were being conditioned to accept that fear was enough. And then something shifted. A voice cut through the silence, uncertain but loud enough to fracture the haze. "Leave her alone." Veronica turned. A young man in a tan apron, someone from one of the vendor tents, stood awkwardly beside his table of succulents. His voice cracked on the word alone. But the damage had been done. The silence broke. Hayes's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. Lancaster leaned over to say something, but the moment had shifted. The spell had cracked. Another voice joined, then another, not a chorus, not a riot, but the beginning of a murmur rising into clarity. Veronica took this moment and moved. She didn't run. She walked slow, poised, as if she were stepping through an invisible barrier and shattering it behind her. She reached her SUV, placed the herb pot gently on the passenger seat, then pulled out her phone again. Not to record this time, but to call. The voice that answered brought tears to her eyes. She refused to let fall. Calm, deep, recognizable. "I'm close," Shaq said. "Where are you?" She whispered the location and sat inside the car as the sun climbed higher above the trees, casting her in light, so bright it burned. From a distance the cruiser idled. Hayes and Lancaster remained, watching, but now they were the ones feeling watched. Their casual smirks no longer belonged to men in control. They were stretched thin, uneasy. The crowd wasn't dispersed anymore. The murmurs had taken root. Even in Coral Bay, the old rules were starting to rot under the scrutiny of daylight. Veronica stayed parked until the cruiser drove off. And as it did, she didn't relax. She didn't collapse into herself or release the tension. She knew better. Because daylight had become no protection. It simply revealed the danger in full. What she didn't know, not yet, was that Shaq was already less than 5 minutes away. And he wasn't coming alone. The SUV's interior felt like a safe house of silence, the kind that barely muffled the storm outside. Veronica sat in the driver's seat, hands on her lap, phone resting like a lifeline on her thigh. Her face remained still, but her pulse throbbed in her neck. The sun had risen high now, flooding the windshield with a light that was almost too pure, too bright, like judgment itself. Outside the air shifted. Hayes and Lancaster had driven away, But they had left something behind, a message wrapped in their stare, in their smirks, in the audacity of their return. You are not welcome here. Veronica's thumb hovered over the last dialed number. She didn't hesitate. She pressed it again. The call didn't ring long. Shaq answered in a voice so steady, so familiar, that she nearly collapsed into it. But she didn't. Not yet. V, he said, already sensing it. Tell me everything. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her voice cracked as she spoke, layering the facts with the restraint of someone who had been taught that emotion is often misread as aggression. She recounted the stops, the stares, the suffocating silence that had turned into harassment in plain view of a crowd too afraid or too complicit to intervene. She spoke not just as a wife, but as a woman who had just been carved open by a system that didn't care how polite she was or whose name she carried. Shaq didn't interrupt. He didn't offer cliches. His silence wasn't passive. It was calculation. When she finished, he exhaled once, low and full of weight. Then he said 3 words. I'm on it. That was all. No dramatics. No panic. Just a calm so absolute, it felt like the ground beneath her had been reinforced. But Veronica knew that tone. That steel behind the softness. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't a man who showed up in pieces. When he moved completely. And when he said he was on it, something far larger than comfort was in motion. What she didn't know, not yet, was who else had been listening. Miles away, Shaq was already behind the wheel of his black Escalade, the engine murmuring like a war drum beneath him. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, not with rage, but with clarity. This wasn't the first time the world had tried to remind him who he was not allowed to be, but this time, it had touched Veronica. And that changed everything. He hit speed dial again, this time not for a family member or friend, but for a name that would surprise even those closest to him. The voice that answered was gravel. Rough, aged, but unmistakably in command. Rourke, the man said. Owen, Shaq replied, the corners of his mouth tightening. We got a problem in Coral Bay. There was a pause, followed by a sigh and the rustle of fabric. Same. It's gotten worse. Public, deliberate. Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice hardened. I'm 20 minutes out. Shaq nodded, though no one could see him. Meet me, at Lakeview. She's still there. Commander Owen Rourke was no stranger to controversy. Once the most decorated police chief in Miami-Dade, he'd retired early after exposing internal corruption that nearly cost him his career. Since then, he'd become something of a ghost in Florida law enforcement circles. Consulting in private, stepping in only when the rot was too deep for internal cleanup, Shaq had helped him through that fallout, paid for legal counsel, housed his daughter when the family received threat. The relationship wasn't born of politics. It was built on blood-deep loyalty. And now, Rourke was coming with him. Back at Lakeview, Veronica sat motionless, unaware of the conversation that had just rewired her morning into a tactical operation. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Shaq. No emojis, no fluff, just, I'm close, not alone. Trust me. She read it twice, then a third time. The silence inside her began to shift. The fear didn't vanish, but it made room for something else. Anticipation, maybe even hope. Meanwhile, across town, the footage of the morning's first confrontation outside Marlowe's had already begun circulating. A local college student had posted it to her story, captioned Coral Bay in broad daylight. Tell me again racism is dead. From there it leapt. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, without names, without confirmation, it still ignited. Some denied it, others defended the officers. But a growing voice, the kind you couldn't pay to silence, was starting to ask the question no one in Coral Bay wanted to answer. Why is this happening again? As Shaq's Escalade turned off the highway, Veronica looked up at the reflection in her side mirror. She didn't see anyone approaching yet, but she felt it. The air itself had shifted, like thunder far off, just beyond the trees. Calm but not quiet. This was no longer just about humiliation or harassment. This was about exposure. And something was coming down that road with the weight of truth strapped to its back. She didn't know yet what it would look like. But it wasn't coming alone. The low rumble of the Escalade approached like distant thunder rolling through an otherwise still sky. Veronica didn't flinch when she heard it. She didn't turn to look right away, didn't crane her neck like the others now subtly gathering near the market's edge. Instead, she sat in her SUV, eyes forward, hands folded in her lap, as though she were waiting for the next chapter of her life to arrive in perfect rhythm. And it did. The black vehicle glided to a stop beside her car, its finish gleaming like oil under the late morning sun. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. Even the breeze paused, then the door opened, and Shaquille O'Neal stepped out, not the entertainer, not the legend in commercials, or the man with a laugh that could fill arenas, but the husband, the protector, the mountain of calm that people underestimated at their peril. He stood tall, his presence bending the atmosphere around him. His frame wasn't just imposing, it was commanding. There was no anger on his face, only an unreadable stillness, a silence that carried years of being misjudged, misread, and mistreated. Not because he lacked success, but because success never shielded him from what it meant to be a black man in America. From the passenger side, another door opened, and with it, the real twist unfolded. Commander Owen Rourke stepped out slowly, his crisp white shirt tucked tightly into dark slacks, his badge clipped to his belt, not hanging around his neck like decoration, but displayed with purpose. He was older, grizzled, the kind of man who'd seen too much and spoken too little. There was an unshakable authority about him, not the kind shouted across streets, but the kind that carried into every room before he even stepped inside. His presence wasn't loud, but it echoed. The market went still. No one had expected him, especially not Hayes and Lancaster, who had looped back around in their cruiser for another patrol circle, and now sat frozen as they saw the two men standing together, side by side. Veronica opened her door and stepped out, her eyes locking with Shaq's. Nothing needed to be said. He walked to her calmly, shielding her from the subtle stares still poking at her like needles. She rested her hand briefly on his chest, just enough to feel that steady anchored heartbeat, and then turned her eyes to Rourke. The chief nodded once, then moved toward the crowd, toward the cruiser. His walk was not rushed, not theatrical, but deliberate, each step like punctuation, on a sentence the town had been trying not to read. Hayes and Lancaster remained seated, unsure whether to stay or drive off. Their silence betrayed them. They had not been trained to fear confrontation, but they had never trained for public accountability either. Rourke tapped twice on the driver's side window. Hayes reluctantly rolled it down. "Step out of the vehicle," Rourke said. His voice was calm, but there was no room for negotiation. Hayes hesitated. Rourke raised an eyebrow, just slightly. Both officers exited the vehicle. Lancaster glanced toward the onlookers, hoping for some invisible backing from the citizens who had always quietly supported them, or at least ignored them. But the crowd was no longer sure who to align with. The sight of Commander Rourke changed things. His presence wasn't political. It was personal, and it was tied clearly to Shaq. "I should have known you were behind this," Hayes muttered, eyes flicking toward Shaq with a mix of resentment and unease. "You always did like showing off." Rourke didn't flinch. "You know what I don't like? Repeat complaints. Cameras catching you smiling in the middle of traffic stops like you're in some damn parade. I warned you once. You thought I was bluffing." Lancaster tried to intervene. "Chief, you're suspended." Rourke cut him off, flatly. "Both of you, hand over your badges, right now." Murmurs rippled through the market. A woman dropped a jar of honey. A man filming from his phone adjusted his grip, angling for a better view. This was no longer a conversation. It was a reckoning. Hayes took a step forward. "You don't have jurisdiction here anymore. You're retired." Rourke smiled, not the kind that offered peace, but the kind that warned of incoming storms. "I'm on special assignment, and I'm here because this man," he nodded toward Shaq, "brought me in. You see, unlike some, he doesn't scream when things go wrong. He calls the right people." Lancaster looked at Shaq now, really looked at him, not as the NBA legend, not as the man on every billboard, but as someone who had power outside the court, real power, and that made him dangerous in their eyes. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded. Shaq finally spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and it carried through the market like a sermon with no need for fire. "You think people like us don't notice what's happening? You think we forget how your eyes follow us, how your tone changes, how your smile curves when you say routine?" He looked at both officers, then at the growing crowd. "My wife went out to buy food. That's all she did. And you tried to shrink her. You tried to make her small. But she's not small, and she's not alone." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The weight in his voice was truth, and truth carried its own volume. Then for the first time, Veronica spoke again. Not to defend, not to explain, but to remind everyone who was watching what this had always been about. I don't want revenge, she said. I want respect, and I want to walk through this town without wondering who's going to make me justify my right to breathe. She looked out at the onlookers, many of whom now looked down, unsure whether to feel ashamed, or outraged, or simply exposed. Rourke turned back to the officers, holding out his hand. They hesitated.
Then, reluctantly, one after another, they placed their badges into his palm.
It was done. The cruiser remained parked like a monument to their failure, while Rourke turned to Shaq and Veronica, his eyes softer now. I owe you, he said quietly. Still do. Shaq nodded once. This wasn't about me. It was about fixing what people like them think they can keep breaking. And with that, the trio began walking away together. Not in triumph, but in quiet reclamation. Behind them, the town of Coral Bay stood still. Something had changed. Not everything, but enough. Main Street had never felt so narrow. It stretched long and polished, flanked by boutiques, banks, and brickfront coffee shops that had always prided themselves on charm. But now, charm had withered beneath the weight of watching eyes. The crowd that once lingered in curiosity had grown in size and stillness, pulled by the magnetic force of reckoning. No one spoke. No one laughed. Phones were raised, some trembling, some steady. A moment was unfolding, and Coral Bay for once couldn't pretend not to see it. Shaq stood near the center of the street, where the sidewalk met the crosswalk outside Magnolia's Deli. The same corner where, weeks ago, a black teenager had been stopped for matching a description on his way to piano lessons. The irony wasn't lost on him. Veronica stood just behind him, not shielded, not hidden, but flanked like the center of gravity. Her presence was no longer a point of tension. It was the point of truth. Rourke remained off to the side, arms crossed, eyes tracking the growing crowd with the wariness of a man who had seen justice collapse under public pressure more than once. He knew this was no longer just a matter of discipline or badges. This had become trial by daylight. And then came the voices. Quiet, scattered, but unmistakable. So they got suspended? A woman asked her husband aloud, not whispering, not ashamed. Another muttered, "'Bout time." A young man in a college hoodie folded his arms and shook his head. Wonder how many times they pulled this before someone caught it. The murmur wasn't angry. It was loaded. A town waking up to its own reflection and not liking what stared back. The guilt was not universal, but the awareness was. Judgment wasn't just descending from the top. It was leaking up from the cracks. And Shaq, he didn't move to silence the crowd. He didn't play the hero or the victim. He simply raised his head, took one step forward onto the brick path leading to City Hall, and "Let me tell you something about shame," he said, not shouting but projecting. His voice a low, steady current that traveled farther than volume ever could. "Shame," he continued, "isn't about what you do in private. It's about what you pretend in public." Coral Bay pretends real well. The crowd tensed. Even the wind seemed to pause to listen. This town smiles at you, holds the door for you, says sir and ma'am, and then watches you get humiliated in the middle of the street, like it's just part of the weather forecast. No one looked away. Even those who had crossed the street to avoid the earlier tension now stood rooted in place, caught between discomfort and recognition. "My wife didn't ask for a show," Shaq went on. "She didn't pull rank. She didn't scream. She stayed calm while two officers tried to unravel her, piece by piece, in front of people who did nothing. And when she stood her ground, they circled back again. Same car, same faces, different tactic. He let the silence sit, then added, "That's not law enforcement. That's harassment in uniform." Veronica stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the faces in the crowd. Some held shame, others guilt, but a few, just a few, held something deeper, something like respect. Because she hadn't broken. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She had stood, and now she stood taller. Shaq pointed not at the crowd, but at the town square itself, the statue of the city's founder, the row of flags, the public office with its flower beds and neatly trimmed hedges. "This place has roots and pride. I get that. But when pride stops you from admitting you've got rot in your walls, that's when it turns dangerous." And then came the sharp edge. Truth sharpened, like a blade. One of those officers? Hayes? He wasn't just warned before. He was covered for twice. Internal complaints buried. Paperwork vanished. I know because I paid the settlement for one of those victims when the town wouldn't. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Even Rourke's jaw tightened. This was the twist no one had seen coming. You think silence protects the town's name? Shaq asked. It doesn't. It stains it. A woman in a floral dress near the back lowered her phone. Her husband pulled his ball cap lower over his eyes. On the other side of the crowd, a boy of no more than 12 looked up at his father and whispered, "That's Big Shaq. He's telling the truth, huh?" His father nodded slowly. "Yeah, he is." Shaq took one last breath and looked toward Veronica, not for reassurance but to center himself. Then he finished what needed to be said. You can't fix everything in one day, but you can stop pretending you don't see it. Coral Bay's better than what we saw this morning. Or at least I hope it wants to be. He stepped back. No mic drop, no applause cue. Just silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of bystanders. It was the silence of something shifting. Rourke finally stepped forward, addressing the crowd for the first time. Those officers are suspended indefinitely. An independent review is being opened. This will not be handled behind closed doors. Someone clapped. One, then two, then more. Veronica turned to Shaq and said softly, "That wasn't just judgment." He looked at her, brow slightly raised. "What was it then?" She smiled, only faintly. "It was a beginning." Long before the crowd began clapping, before Shaq spoke truth into a silence too long protected, there were whispers, soft-spoken stories in the corners of Coral Bay. Stories that never made the news, never reached a podium, but lived in the shadows like mildew behind polished walls. Names were exchanged in low voices, complaints filed and lost in procedural fog. Victims left town quietly, or stayed quiet, because here in Coral Bay your peace often depended on how still you could remain. But Shaq had never been built for silence. As Rourke stood near the cruiser, holding two surrendered badges in his hand like physical receipts of a debt long overdue, the history behind those metal tokens began to unspool. Unseen by the crowd, but present in every line on his face. He had known, not just about today's incident, but about the long trail of incidents that had preceded it. It began almost 4 years ago. Deputy Colton Hayes, still new to Coral Bay at the time, had been involved in a late-night stop just outside the residential West End. A local delivery driver, young, quiet, college-bound, was pulled over under suspicion of driving erratically. There was no ticket, no report, just bruises no one ever documented, and a sudden withdrawal from school 2 weeks later. His mother, a nurse at a nearby clinic, had filed a formal complaint. Rourke, still chief then, investigated quietly, but the evidence didn't hold, or rather, it was made not to hold. The dashcam footage was missing, corrupted, the department claimed. The officer's body cam had been powered off accidentally. Statements contradicted each other, and the only thing that remained consistent was a closed case and a family that eventually packed up and left. Rourke had kept the mother's handwritten letter, folded neatly in his desk drawer, written in pen on lined paper. No lawyer, no lawsuit, just a plea. If you can't help my son, help the next one. Then there was Lancaster. 2 years prior, another incident. This one quieter. A local high school had reported a student being questioned aggressively by an off-duty officer while walking home. The student was a varsity football player, honors student, son of a retired firefighter. Lancaster hadn't been named officially, but every student at Coral Bay High knew who it was. The school hushed it. The department deflected. Rourke had fought to push the issue, but by then he was already being edged toward retirement. Fresh leadership, the mayor had said. So when Shaq had reached out to Rourke weeks ago, long before today, long before Veronica's confrontation ever made the feeds, it hadn't been a casual conversation. It was a strategy call. "I need you to be ready," Shaq had told him. "I've been watching. So have others. If it happens again, it's not staying buried." And now it hadn't. The officer's suspension was more than an administrative act. It was a public marker, one Coral Bay had never allowed before. And the people in the square, the ones still holding their phones, weren't just witnessing it. They were beginning to believe it. Not just in the injustice, but in the possibility that it might finally come to light. Near the edge of the crowd, a man in a mechanic's uniform turned to the florist beside him. "I always wondered what happened to Jamal's kid. Thought he just up and quit school." The florist didn't respond. Her eyes were still on Rourke, her expression frozen, not in denial, but in dawning recognition. Because she had seen it too. Little things, tense interactions, unequal treatment dressed in official protocol. The perception shifted like fog giving way to coastline. Suddenly what had seemed like isolated moments began to connect. Threads once dismissed, now wove into a tapestry of truth. And it wasn't just about Hayes and Lancaster. It was about Coral Bay itself, about how a town could look beautiful on the surface and rot silently beneath. Veronica stood back from the thick of the crowd, watching the revelation not just unfold, but land. The eyes that had once looked at her with suspicion, with subtle dismissal, were now looking inward, into their own role, their silence, their applause for the wrong things. Her humiliation had become their mirror, and the reflection was not easy to look at. Shaq moved beside Rourke, voice low, but direct. "They'll try to quiet this. Spin it." Rourke nodded, unsurprised. "Let them try. The video's already out. You started the conversation. I'll finish what I can." There was no victory lap. No grand declaration. Just a quiet understanding between two men who had seen enough of how systems bend to protect themselves. Today wasn't justice. It was exposure. But sometimes, exposure was more powerful than any gavel. As the sun shifted higher and the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing, still filming, still processing, the air in Coral Bay felt different. Not cleansed, not cured, but pierced. And once light gets in, it doesn't leave easy. The morning had shifted from confrontation to reflection, but the air in Coral Bay still hummed with the tension of exposed truth. The crowd had thinned but not vanished. Small groups clustered on corners, murmuring in low tones, dissecting what they had just witnessed, what they had just become part of. It wasn't over. In a town built on silence and subtleties, what had occurred in full daylight now pulsed through the community like a second heartbeat. And in the center of it, Shaq stood, not as a symbol of fury or vengeance, but as something harder to define. Steady, grounded, intentional. There had been enough noise. Now came the weight of what followed. Veronica stood beside him, calm but emotionally raw. Her silence didn't mean retreat. It was recovery, the kind of quiet that only follows after your dignity has been pulled through fire and handed back to you intact. She didn't need to speak. Her presence had already echoed through the town louder than any shouted accusation. Near the steps of City Hall, Commander Rourke prepared a short statement. The press had begun to arrive, not in droves, but enough to suggest that this story wouldn't stay confined to Coral Bay's borders. Tripods emerged from trunks. Reporters scanned their phone. Microphones with network logos were clipped to jackets. Rourke adjusted the file in his hand, took one last look toward Shaq, then nodded as if to say, "Time to turn the page." But before he stepped forward, Shaq raised a hand. Not to halt, but to offer something unexpected. "Let me speak first," he said. Rourke paused, then stepped aside. Shaq didn't use the podium. He didn't look into cameras. He faced the people, the shopkeepers, the parents, the teens on bikes, the elders who had lived in Coral Bay long enough to recognize when something was breaking for real. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," Shaq said, voice even but unflinching. "That's what some of you might expect. Public embarrassment, retaliation. But that's not why I came." He looked out across the sidewalk. Some faces nodded, others waited, unsure. "I came because my wife was harassed in plain sight. Because the people who were supposed to protect her chose to diminish her instead. And because too many others saw it happen and looked away. That's not a crime, but it's a choice." He let the silence settle before continuing. "This town is better than its silence. Or it can be." Then, to the surprise of many, including Rourke, Shaq shifted his stance and spoke directly to Hayes and Lancaster, who now stood to the side in plain clothes, stripped of their uniforms, but still cloaked in the consequences of their actions. "I don't need you punished to feel powerful," Shaq said, "but I do need you accountable to believe this town can move forward." He didn't shout. He didn't belittle. He simply named the truth and let it live. Hayes looked down. Lancaster shifted his weight, but said nothing. Whatever bravado they'd once carried had eroded beneath the gravity of the day. "Redemption isn't free," Shaq continued. "It comes when you face the weight of what you've done, and then choose something different the next time. If there is a next time." A few people clapped soft hesitant, but it wasn't for show. It was because something within them stirred. Because someone had stood before them and offered not revenge, but reform. And in a world saturated with conflict, That kind of strength felt foreign, sacred. Veronica stepped forward beside Shaq and said just one thing. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means we don't carry your shame with us anymore. And with that they turned. No dramatic exit. No declarations. Just dignity. Behind them, Rourke gave the official statement, formal internal investigation, third-party oversight, training protocol revisions, and an open channel for citizen complaints. It was all overdue. But it mattered, because it had been forced into the light. Hayes and Lancaster would not be returning to duty. Not soon, and maybe not ever. The department wasn't just reacting anymore. It was changing, slowly, publicly, because that was the only way Coral Bay would believe in it again. As Shaq and Veronica walked down Main Street, past stores that had once stared her down, past the cafe that had turned into a courtroom, people stepped aside, but not out of fear, out of respect. Quietly, some offered nods, others lowered their eyes, not in shame, but in acknowledgement, the kind of gesture that says, I see it now, I should have seen it before. By the time they reached the SUV, parked in the same spot where it all began, the sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows behind them. Veronica placed her hand on the door but paused. You think it'll hold? She asked. Shaq followed her gaze back to the crowd behind them. If it doesn't, he said, we'll do it again. Then they got in and drove away, together, whole, unbroken. And for the first time in a long time, Coral Bay didn't look away. Coral Bay had always moved slow in the mornings. The breeze rolled off the water in syrupy waves, the town's tempo set by coffee cups, bike pedals, and polite nods exchanged across patios. But something in that rhythm had changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't noisier. It was aware, as if the town had finally heard its own heartbeat for the first time, and found it irregular. In the weeks following the confrontation on Main Street, Coral Bay found itself standing before its own reflection. No longer shielded by tradition or charm, the town had been publicly profoundly shaken, its image exposed, its habits questioned. But instead of retreating, a current of quiet reckoning began to flow. The same cafe that once served as silent witness to Veronica's humiliation now displayed a sign in its window, Justice lives where truth is welcome. It was handwritten, imperfect, but sincere. A series of town forums had been organized, initiated not by government mandate, but by residents, teachers, business owners, teenagers who had posted the videos that reached national platforms. They gathered in the library, in the church basements, on the lawn behind City Hall. Conversations were hard. Some came defensive, others came ashamed, but most, surprisingly, stayed. The words weren't always eloquent, but they were real, because real things had finally been said first. Commander Rourke, no longer operating from the sidelines, accepted a temporary position to oversee the reforms he'd once been forced to abandon. Officers from neighboring counties rotated in to assist with retraining. A civilian review board was formed, with Veronica personally invited to participate. She declined the title, but accepted a seat at the table. I'm not here to manage the town, she said. I'm here to remind it what people look like when they've had enough. But the heart of the town's shift wasn't at any meeting. It wasn't on any flyer. It wasn't even in the footage that continued to circulate online. It was in the unexpected places. It was in the white-haired woman who had whispered something cruel outside the flower market, and now brought a pot of rosemary to Veronica's doorstep. No note, just the plant, and a quiet glance through the gate as she walked away. It was in the teenage boy who, weeks after standing silent during the confrontation, began organizing walk-in Wednesdays at local shops, encouraging businesses to speak openly with patrons of color about how they could do better. And it was in the man whose voice had cracked when he shouted, "Leave her alone." That vendor, whose name was Greg, found himself becoming a figure in the local high school's social studies curriculum. After a student wrote an essay titled, "The First Voice," Coral Bay had needed a spark. He had been the accidental match. Shaq didn't seek attention. Not after that day. The media tried to keep him in the story, but he politely stepped back. He knew the danger of letting a moment become a monument. He didn't want to be a statue erected in the center of town. He wanted Coral Bay to move, with or without him. Still, they couldn't help but honor him. It was a quiet morning when it happened. The community center's basketball court, once underfunded and rarely used, had been repainted, repaved, and renamed. Not the Shaquille O'Neal court as most expected, but the lane, Veronica's maiden name. Underneath it, a quote in brushed gold lettering read, "Strength isn't size, It's what you stand for when the world tries to make you small. Shaq stood beside her the day they unveiled it. There were no press crews, no speeches, just neighborhood kids shooting hoops. And one little girl who asked Veronica if she could teach her how to walk like she did on TV that day, like a boss. Veronica smiled and said, "You already know how. You just haven't been reminded yet." And life moved on. But it moved differently. The officers never returned to service. Official records confirmed that Hayes had quietly left the state, and Lancaster had taken up work outside of law enforcement. No charges were filed. There was no televised trial, but their names no longer held quiet protection. They held memory. And in a town like Coral Bay, that memory echoed. Not everyone celebrated. Not everyone believed the change would hold, and some, of course, insisted the incident had been exaggerated. But those voices no longer defined the room. They had volume, not weight. As summer turned to fall, Coral Bay began to breathe in deeper rhythms. The school added new curriculum around civil liberties. The local news ran a special called After the Video. People started to know their officers by name, and the officers started to remember the weight of theirs. It was a small town after all. You couldn't hide behind a badge when your badge now came with a spotlight. And Shaq? He left the cameras and returned to his quieter work, building schools, funding scholarships, mentoring young men who had never seen justice walk tall in real life. His height still made him tower, but it was his heart that people talked about now. In barbershops, in community halls, in quiet moments between friends who knew that the man they once admired for basketball had become something more off the court. A giant of heart. And Coral Bay, once content to be small in all the wrong ways, had just begun to grow around that legacy. Not with banners, not with fireworks, but with honesty. And that was enough. For now, what would you do if silence was no longer safe? When dignity is challenged in daylight, some look away, and others step in. Coral Bay didn't need a hero. It needed a witness who wouldn't blink. This isn't just a story, it's a mirror, and the next reflection could be yours.